Welcome to Dread Wave, where nightmares never end. The digital clock on Brendan Bennett's nightstand blinked 3:17 a.m. when the doorbell rang. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, that liminal space between sleep and consciousness playing tricks on his mind. But then it rang again, the sound piercing through his third-floor apartment like a knife through silk. Brendan sat up, his 32-year-old body protesting the sudden movement. Sweat had soaked through his gray t-shirt, though his apartment wasn't particularly warm for a September night. He'd been having that dream again, the one about Jessica, the one he'd been having ever since she disappeared 3 months ago. The doorbell rang a third time. "What the ___," he muttered, reaching for his phone. No messages, no missed calls. Nobody he knew would show up at this ungodly hour without texting first. The small hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floors creaked beneath his feet as he made his way to the front door. Through the peephole, the hallway appeared empty, just the usual flickering fluorescent light that the building manager had promised to fix weeks ago, casting strange shadows on the worn carpet. Brendan stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd watched enough horror movies to know better than to open the door. But then again, this was real life, not some cheap slasher film. Plus, he had a baseball bat in the stand by the door, a remnant from his college days that now served as an impromptu security measure. He grabbed the bat and opened the door. The hallway was empty, just as the peephole had shown. But there, sitting innocently on his welcome mat, was a box. Not just any box, a perfectly wrapped gift box in deep crimson paper topped with an elaborate black satin bow. The kind of box you'd expect to see under a Christmas tree, not outside your door in the middle of the night. Brendan's grip tightened on the bat as he scanned the hallway. Again, the elevator at the far end remained silent, its digital display showing it was still on the ground floor. The stairwell door was closed, and he hadn't heard it open or close. Whoever had left us must have moved incredibly quickly and quietly. He crouched down to examine the box without touching it. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, maybe a bit larger. The wrapping job was immaculate, professional grade, with crisp corners and not a single visible tape line. The bow was tied with precision, its loops perfectly symmetrical. There was no card, no tag, nothing to indicate its origin or intended recipient, but he knew it was for him. It had to be. Jessica had promised she'd send him something when the time was right. She said in their last conversation, "You'll know it's from me." But that was before she'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a cryptic voicemail that the police had dismissed as irrelevant. Brendan's hand hovered over the box, trembling slightly. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to call the police, to not touch the mysterious package that had appeared outside his door in the dead of night. But another part, the part that had been slowly unraveling since Jessica's disappearance, wondered if this was finally it, the sign he'd been waiting for. He picked up the box. It was lighter than he expected, almost weightless. No sounds came from within when he gently shook it, nothing shifted or rattled. A sudden movement at the end of the hallway caught his eye, a shadow perhaps. The fluorescent light flickered again, and for a split second, he could have sworn he saw a figure in black standing motionless by the stairwell door. When the light stabilized, there was nothing there. Brendan retreated into his apartment, closing and double-locking the door behind him. He placed the box on his coffee table and sank into his couch, staring at it as if it might suddenly spring to life. His phone buzzed, making him jump in shock. Unknown number. Hello? His voice cracked slightly. Silence, and then breathing, slow, measured breaths that made his skin crawl. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the line went dead. Brendan's hand shook as he placed his phone face down on the coffee table. The red box sat there, mocking him with its perfect presentation. He reached for it again, then pulled back. But something felt wrong. He got up and paced his living room, running his hands through his disheveled dark hair. The box seemed to follow his movement, though he knew that was impossible. It was just a box, just paper and cardboard and ribbon. But then why did it feel like it was watching him? Immediately, another buzz from his phone, a text this time, from the same unknown number. Open it. This, Brendan muttered, grabbing his phone to call the police. But before he could dial, another text came through. She wanted you to have it. His blood ran cold. Jessica. They were talking about Jessica. The room suddenly felt small, the air thick. Brendan loosened the collar of his t-shirt, trying to breathe normally. The box remained unchanged, yet somehow it seemed larger now, more imposing. The red paper appeared darker, almost the color of dried blood in the dim light of his apartment. He needed a drink. Badly. Brendan stumbled to his kitchen and pulled out the bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. This definitely qualified. He didn't bother with the glass, taking a long pull directly from the bottle. The liquid burned his throat, but it helped steady his nerves. When he returned to the living room, something was different. The bow on the box had shifted slightly, one loop hanging lower than before. He was certain it had been perfectly symmetrical when he brought it in. Another text, time's running out. Who the are you? He typed back with trembling fingers. The response came instantly. Open the box, Brendan. He took another drink, longer this time. The whiskey was starting to take effect, dulling the edges of his fear and replacing it with a dangerous curiosity. He sat down on the couch again, placing the bottle on the coffee table next to the box. The red paper seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, or was that just the alcohol playing tricks on his mind? Brendan reached for the bow, then jerked his hand back as a burr burned. The satin ribbon felt cold, unnaturally cold, through his fingerprints. His phone buzzed again. She's waiting. Jessica's dead, isn't she? He typed back, tears blurring his vision. No response. The air in the apartment grew heavier, pressing down on him like a physical weight. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, reaching towards him with ghostly fingers, and the box remained the only spot of color in his increasingly gray world. Brendan grabbed the bottle again, but it slipped from his sweaty hands, spilling amber liquid across the coffee table. The whiskey flowed around the base of the box but didn't touch it, as if repelled by an invisible barrier. His phone lit up with another message. You know what happened to her? No, he whispered. No, I don't. But didn't he? The memories he'd been suppressing for 3 months began to surface, like corpses rising from the depths of a dark lake. That last night with Jessica, the argument, the way she looked at him with such disappointment and such fear, the sound of his own voice distorted by rage and alcohol, the slam of the doors as she left, and then nothing. A blank space where memories should be, but aren't. The box seemed to mock him now, its presence an accusation he couldn't deny. Another text, the truth is in the box. Brendan's hands moved of their own accord, reaching for the ribbon. The satin was ice cold against his skin as he pulled one end, watching the perfect bow unravel like a black snake. The ribbon fell away, coiling on the coffee table. His phone buzzed continuously now, message after message appearing. Open it. Open it. Open it. Open it now. The red paper seemed to ripple. Though there was no breeze in the apartment and Brendan's fingers found the edges, searching for the seams, the paper fell away in a single piece, revealing a plain white box underneath. His heart thundered in his chest as he lifted the lid. It was empty. The box was completely and utterly empty. Brendan stared into the void within, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, or rather, what he wasn't seeing. No note, no clue, no sign from Jessica. Nothing but darkness that seemed to grow deeper than the physical dimensions of the box should allow. His phone rang, making him drop the box. It was the unknown number again. This time, when he answered, there was no breathing, no silence, just the voice he recognized immediately, Jessica's voice, speaking words that made his blood freeze in his veins. "You already know what's in the box, Brendan. You put it there." The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah's body going limp in his hands, the sound of her last breath leaving her lungs, the weight of her as he carried her to her car in the dead of the night, the hole he dug in the woods miles from anywhere, the empty box he buried next to her, a sick joke that had seemed hilarious in his drunken, psychotic state. The box that now sat on his coffee table. Brendan screamed, scrambling away from the coffee table until his back hit the wall. The box remained where it was, innocent and empty, yet somehow more terrifying than any horror he could have imagined. His phone lit up one final time. "The police are coming," said the voice. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Red and blue lights began to flash through his windows, painting the walls in alternating colors that matched the box's crimson hue. Brendan slid down the wall, his legs no longer able to support him. The box watched him from its perch on the coffee table, its empty interior a mirror to the void in his soul. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, down the hallway, and the pounding on his door was almost unnecessary. It would have been child's play. To break through his deteriorating mental state, police opened up. Brennan couldn't move, he couldn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on the box as the door burst open, and officers flooded his apartment with drawn weapons and harsh commands. "Sir, step away from the box." One officer approached the coffee table cautiously, while others secured Brennan's trembling form. The first officer lifted the box, examining it carefully. "It's empty, sir," he reported to his superior. "It's just an empty gift box." The officers' voices seemed distant, almost underwater, as they processed the scene. Brennan watched with glazed eyes as they photographed the box, the spilled whiskey, his phone still lighting up with messages. "Sir, we need you to take a look at this," one of the officers said, holding up Brennan's phone. The screen showed hundreds of messages, all from an unknown number, all time-stamped at exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time he had heard the first doorbell. But that wasn't what made his stomach turn. It was the content of the messages, each one a detailed description of what he'd done to Jessica that night, things he'd buried so deep in his psyche that even his nightmares couldn't access them. The way she begged, the sound her nails made when they scraped across his hardwood floor, the exact shade of purple her lips had turned. "These messages," the officer continued, his voice hard, "have already been sent to the forensics team. They're heading to the location mentioned in them right now." Location? Brennan's mind raced. He hadn't told anyone where he'd buried her. He'd been so careful, driving for hours into the wilderness, choosing a spot so remote that, the box suddenly seemed to grow larger, its empty interior yawning like a hungry mouth. The crimson paper that had fallen away began to move on its own, folding itself into origami shapes, flowers, birds, and briefly, a perfect paper replica of Jessica's face, contorted in her final expression of terror and fear. "That's not possible," Brennan whispered. But the officers didn't seem to notice the paper's movements. They were too busy securing the scene, calling in additional units, preparing for what they would inevitably find in the woods. His phone continued its relentless assault, new messages now, each one accompanied by a photo he'd never taken but somehow existed, Jessica's car in this parking spot the night she disappeared, Brendan carrying something wrapped in a blanket to his car at 2:43 in the morning, the fresh dirt on his shoe when he returned home at dawn. "The box," he croaked, drawing the attention of the nearest officer. "The box isn't empty. It can't be empty." The officer glanced at the box, then back at Brendan with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Sir, the box is empty. Just like that hole we're going to find in the woods, right?" You know, the one you filled with perhaps something else. The walls of the apartment began to bleed crimson trails matching the color of the gift wrap. Brendan could see Jessica's face in each droplet, her smile from their first date, her laugh from their vacation in Mexico, her tears from their last fight. The memories he tried to drown in whiskey and denial were all there, painted in red across his walls. The figure in black materialized again, this time in the corner of his kitchen. It moved with an impossible fluidity, like smoke given form. As it approached, Brendan could smell Sarah's perfume, the vanilla and jasmine scent she'd always worn. The figure reached into the empty box and pulled out something that wasn't there before, Sarah's necklace, the one he'd buried her with. The only thing he buried her with other than the box. The silver pendant caught the light from the police flashlights, throwing dancing reflections across the wall that spelled out the words only Brendan could read, "You can't hide anymore." I need to use the bathroom," Brendan stammered, but the officers ignored his request. They were focused on a new development. The radios crackled with confirmation that ground-penetrating radar had detected something at the location, something box-shaped, buried next to something larger. The figure in black was closer, now close enough that Brendan could see through its dark shroud. Sarah's face flickered beneath the fabric, but not as she had been in life. This was Sarah as she was now, after 3 months in the wet earth. Her eyes were empty sockets, her skin mottled and gray, her mouth fixed in the same silent scream from that final night. She reached out with decomposing fingers and touched the empty box. At her touch, the box began to fill, not with physical objects, but with memories. They spilled out like a toxic fog. Every lie he told the police, every false lead he'd called in, every fake text he'd sent from her phone to throw them off the trail. But worse than the memories were the possibilities, visions of what could have been if he'd controlled his temper, if he'd let her leave, if he'd been a better man. The officers were reading his rights again, but all he could hear was Sarah's voice coming from everywhere. The box was never empty, Brendan. It was full of everything that you tried to forget, everything you tried to bury with me. His legs gave out completely, and as the officers caught him, preventing his collapse, he saw the truth. The box hadn't been delivered to expose his crime, it had been there all along, sitting in his soul, waiting to be opened. The stranger in black hadn't brought it, they'd simply made him see what he'd been carrying since that night. The box wasn't empty, it was full of truth, full of guilt, full of the darkness he tried to hide even from himself. And now, as the officers cuffed his hands behind his back and read him his rights, he understood, the true horror wasn't in what the box contained, but in what it had revealed.